Hi everybody, and welcome to today's video. I've picked out a practical chess ending for us to look at today, and it's one that crops up quite frequently in practice. And this ending is white to play and win. I'll just say briefly that this ending is one that if you don't know the precise technique required, it's quite difficult to it's difficult to stumble on the correct solution over the board. So it's well worth familiarizing yourself with the technique if you don't already know it. So black's objective is obviously to push the e-pawn and queen it. White's objective is to find a way to coordinate his king and queen and eventually capture this pawn before black can queen it. So what is the problem? What makes this difficult? Well, if black ever gets a single free tempo, he's going to push this pawn. And what often happens is that the side with the superior forces does not find the right technique for gaining a tempo, and so he ends up just checking and checking and checking and checking without ever making any progress. And I've seen many times juniors or weaker players ending up agreeing to a draw because they can't find the right strategy for gaining a tempo. So it's all about gaining a single tempo, and then having gained that tempo, being able to advance the king one square at a time closer to the pawn. Just for the sake of reinforcing the technique, I've put the king as far away from the pawn as possible so that you can see how it's done. Okay, so let's get into it. The first move, the best first move, is just queen to b4, and the idea of queen b4 is that we're trying to gain control of e1. If black makes a mistake in this early stage by playing king d1 or king e3, the queen would simply move to e1, blockading the pawn with an impregnable position, and the king would just come down, and we would capture the pawn and win easily. So when you're the defensive side, when you have the pawn, anytime white is threatening to come to e1, it's important that you prevent that by keeping a watchful eye on the e1 square. So that would mean staying on one of these four squares where the king would still control e1. So in this case we would need to come to d1. So king to d1 is the best reply. And now what the white queen wants to do is keep delivering checks and all the while getting closer to the pawn. So now queen to d4 check. When you're the defensive side, what you want to avoid is bringing your king in front of your own pawn and blockading it, because when you do that, you're giving white a free move, a free tempo, when he would be able to advance his own king towards the pawn, which is actually, white's goal is to get this free tempo, so you want to avoid it at all costs. So in this situation, it's actually better to go to c2, because on c2 white is not threatening to come to e1, so it's okay to step out of this rectangle. So king to c2, and now we bring the queen as close as possible to the pawn without, putting our queen where it could be taken. So now we're targeting the pawn, and black is forced to come to d1 to defend the pawn. So we've almost reached the first critical position. So after king to d1, we have queen to d3, and this is the critical position. So you should try to remember that this is what you're aiming for, because now black is forced to do the move he would prefer not to. And this is the part that over the board people don't find, this idea of forcing the king in front of the pawn. So now after king to e1, we take this vital moment to not make another queen move, but rather to advance the king. So after king to f1 would be a mistake here, because queen to f3 and we're at the critical position again. I'll just show you that once to speed things along a little bit. So here already the king would be forced and we get a free move. So the better approach is just to come up onto the second rank, and when you're the attacking player, the correct approach here is to come also to the second rank, and in doing so what we do is pin the pawn, which is actually now prohibited from moving. And so after this move the king needs to keep an eye on e1, so he comes to d1, and after d1 we come back and deliver check and try to get close to the pawn again. So king to c2, queen e3, king d1, and once again the critical position. King e1, king e5, king f2, the key position again with the pin, king f1, queen f4, king g2, queen e3, threatening the pawn, king f1, and another critical position. So we're just repeating this technique of driving the king in front of the pawn. Your opponent of course may not put up the best defense, and this could be happening much more quickly. So now king to e4, the king's almost ideally placed now. You can start to support the queen. So now after king d2, we don't pin this time, because with the support of the queen we can just deliver check. And after king e1, the king can come to e3, and we're threatening to win the pawn. So king f1, queen takes f2, king g1, and now we just move the king towards the corner, setting up the mate. And there it is. So that technique, if we just go back to the beginning, if the pawn is on f1, e1, no, sorry, not f1, e1, d1, b1, or g1, this technique will work. The f pawn and c pawn do not work due to a stalemate idea, and let me just show you that very quickly. So here the pawn is on the f file. We're in the critical position, but as the defender in this position, what you would want to do is play king h1, not to move in front of the pawn, because now the white queen is forced to move away, because after queen takes f2 we're in a stalemate situation, since the white queen is blocking off all of these squares. So be aware of this defensive idea if it's a f or a c pawn, and you'll be able to hold the game. Well, thanks.